A long campaign is now.
This is the car market in Mogadishu.
NATO's military success against
many Western nations.
This is on assignment.
Hey everybody, welcome to the show. I'm Alex Villarreal. This is our very first show of the new year.
Hey, Happy New Year.
Thank you. Happy New Year to you and to all of you.
And Happy New Year to everyone else. I'm Imran Siddiqui. 2015 is here. And to start off the new year, we are looking back at some of the stories of historical significance we brought you in 2014.
First up, they themselves have been witnesses to history, 100 years old or older and still loving life. We introduce you once again to some amazing centenarians.
It was a moment watched around the world, the fall of the Berlin Wall and its effects on Germany 25 years later.
And the secret world of a shuttered nuclear missile site, VOA goes inside a Cold War era relic.
Don't go away. On Assignment's first episode of 2015 starts right now.
Gertrude Weaver of the U.S. state of Arkansas celebrated her 116th birthday last year, officially becoming the oldest living American. But she's just one member of a fast-growing segment of the U.S. population, people who are 100 years old or older.
VOA's Julie Tabou caught up with three such centenarians to learn their secrets to a long life. You gotta check this out.
I played the piano and sang. I was in New York. I was at the Pierre Hotel, which is beautiful.
Each one of the people that I had the privilege of interviewing has their own unique take on what life is for them and what makes it worth living for them. And for Marianne was music, but it's like so many other things. There's so much more. She not only plays music, all from memory, but she also wrote about 130 of her own songs. But she comes to this community center in Friendship Village where she lives, and it's a joy for her to come for 1 hour a week, play her piano. Everyone comes from all over to have tea and coffee and cookies and just listen to her playing. And she just says it's something that is one of the many things, but one of the main things that keeps her going.
And so amazing too to see these three that you focused on and their level of energy. I mean, it was just remarkable. So let's talk about George.
Poor people didn't have automobiles. We walked everywhere. We walked to school, we walked to church, we walked to the store, we walked to visit. And by walking 4 and 5 miles every day, I think had a lot to do with conditioning my body.
George Boggess was really inspiring. We caught up with him at a Veterans Administration where he spends 5 days a week and then he goes home on the weekend. His wife Dorothy, who's 97, takes care of him on the weekends and then he's at the hospital the rest of the week. And when I got talking to him, it was just amazing how much he revealed. First of all, growing up in Texas, he lost his parents at a very young age, so he and his sister were living with relatives. And they had these strict rules about work and school and church. And then he met his wife, Dorothy, and married her just before he went off to fight in World War II. And as an African American, back then, the country was still deeply segregated. He talks about how it was implied, and in some cases, very clearly told him that as a black soldier, they did not have the same expectation of him as the other soldiers.
It was thought that black soldiers could not live up to expectations of the other soldiers. But we proved during the Battle of the Bulge that that was a false assumption. We stayed and we fought. We won.
That's what's so fascinating really about talking to people who have lived these long lives, is that they've really lived through what we now consider to be history.
Exactly. I mean, he is living proof of a veteran who served honorably in his country and was so brave. When I asked George what was one of his most memorable memories of his experience in Battle of the Bulge, he said it was so cold. And he said, we just figured it was nothing to lose and we were just going to fight to the end. And he just was amazed, and he said it was a miracle that he survived.
Such an incredible life, and married for more than 70 years. That's amazing. But I want to talk now about Madeline Brown, who was never married.
Why should I marry one man and make him miserable when I could stay single and make them all happy?
That pretty much summed up her whole philosophy on life, is that she's there to just love people and enjoy people. She's a cancer survivor, so she went through a period of time where she was writing letters to cancer survivors, encouraging them. And they just love her there at the facility where she's living.
I think a lot of people who look at someone who's lived to be 100 or older wonders, what's the secret? So what would you say after meeting with them? What are their secrets?
Well, you know, I think first taking care of yourself. I mean, there was this common denominator that they do take care of themselves. They try to eat well, they try to sleep, they try to exercise when they can. But far more importantly is their zest for life.
And the right attitude. Attitude, attitude, attitude. Remember that.
That's correct. Attitude is right, and a good one can take you a long way.
It really can.
And speaking of attitude, people in Berlin, Germany got quite the attitude adjustment on November 9, 1989. That's the day the Berlin Wall fell, and the world suddenly opened up to people living under communism in East Germany.
Well, despite its troubled past, some look back on the East Germany of the Cold War with nostalgia, a phenomenon known as ostalgie. But as VOA's Henry Ridgewell tells On Assignment's Rebecca Ward, many older Germans have no fondness for the Berlin Wall and the repression it represented.
In 1961, August 13th, 1961 is the day that the wall went up, virtually overnight. Dividing the city, dividing families, people even crossing the wall using buildings to jump out, go in one entrance and jump out the other side into West Germany. That's what it was like initially. Burkhard Weigel, he's now 76, and he told me that it became his lifelong work really to try and give people their freedom, and he thought initially the best way to smuggle people through was via tunnels.
I asked every escapee if they were scared, and not a single one said they were frightened during the escape. They think this has to work, and I will behave correctly.
Weigel was an expert passport forger.
And this was a refugee.
He modified a Cadillac to hide a person inside the dashboard. Hundreds escaped to the west thanks to his ingenuity.
And then he tells the story of the day that he found out that the wall had fallen, and he came in and looked at the television screen and said he just burst into tears.
You know, it's so interesting as you're telling this story, and I'm thinking about people who, you have a word in here, ostalgie? We would say nostalgia.
Ostalgie, yes, that's right. Ostalgie, Ost in German means east, so it's nostalgia really for East Germany. Particularly among the icons and the old sort of items that you used to be able to buy in the East. The Trabants, those old plastic cars that were made in East Germany, the old sweets, the washing powders, the childhood things that everyone might be sort of nostalgic for. Among those who lived in East Germany, there is a theory that some of them are nostalgic for perhaps a more straightforward, more predictable way of life, where you've sort of got a guaranteed job from the state. You know what your expenses are, you know what your job is going to earn, you know what you're going to do for your holidays. And when the wall came down, many East Germans felt that suddenly they were exposed to what they were told was a very sort of voracious capitalist system that could sort of eat them up and spit them out the other side. And of course, like any type of nostalgia, there's an element of looking through rose-tinted glasses, and nobody really in Germany wants to go back to that system. But it's an interesting aspect as people look back 25 years on after the wall has fallen.
The surviving infrastructure of the old regime provides a strong antidote to ostalgie. This was known as the Palace of Tears, a checkpoint at Friedrichstrasse station. The wall divided families and friends overnight. The Berlin Wall Memorial is a powerful testimony to the conditions in the East that drove so many to try to escape.
There was no political sort of freedom of speech, no freedom of travel, and no freedom for the press.
For younger generations in unified Germany, ostalgie is confined to museums and history books. For many of those who grew up in the East, childhood nostalgia is mixed with painful memories.
I wanted to ask you, Henry, about your experience growing up in Europe. How did you experience seeing it from just a European view?
I was only 10 years old when the wall came down, so just in my history lessons at school, and I do remember the history teacher coming in and telling us this was the most important day of our lives so far in world history. You'll remember this for the rest of your lives. Since then, it has become clear that this was a momentous day for Europe, of course, not just for Germany. To have a divided Europe, to have that Iron Curtain, as it was famously called, that divided Europe in half, really felt as if there was a potential war on your doorstep. And since the wall has come down, it's been discovered that there were Soviet nuclear missile bases just north of Berlin, so really a few hundred kilometers from the capitals of Western Europe, London, Paris, and so on. So the world really was geared up physically to an East-West confrontation in those days. And I think really that's what scares a lot of people about the current geopolitics of the tensions between East and West, because they know, we know what can happen. And so when we talk about currently about President Putin and the tensions between he and Western leaders, there is a history of that, and that's why it is really quite so frightening.
And again, our thanks to Henry Ridgewell, reporting for VOA from Europe.
We're taking a break now, but when we return, another look at an ominous Cold War era artifact, a nuclear missile site. You're watching On Assignment.
Welcome back, everyone, to the very first On Assignment of 2015. I, again, am Alex Villarreal, here with my co-host, Imran Siddiqui. Well, back in 2011, the U.S. and Russia agreed to shrink their stockpile of land-based nuclear missiles, continuing a process that began under U.S. President Ronald Reagan.
As the number of nuclear missiles has shrunk, so has the need for launch sites. VOA's Kane Faribault went inside a shuttered site in North Dakota. Here's a look back at what he told On Assignment's Philip Alexio about the experience.
The place where I went is very similar to what an active launch control facility for these nuclear missiles looks like today. A lot of the equipment that you see when you're down there 70 to 100 feet below the surface is the same equipment that they're using in the active Minuteman missile silos that are spread across the country today. However, it's interesting because when these were decommissioned in 1998, everything that was inside the building was left as it is. So when you walk into the structure for the first time and you walk on the upstairs part of the launch facility, you'll see magazines, Time magazines, Newsweek magazines, ping pong tables. These things are all as they were on the day that the people who lived here or manned these things left in 1998.
Oscar Zero is now called the Ronald Reagan Minuteman Missile State Historic Site. Supervisor Gwen Hinman offers tours below the surface, taking visitors into the heart of the front line of the Cold War, where a small crew of missileers waited behind thick steel blast doors and reinforced concrete for the fateful decision to launch their nuclear missiles.
We like to say they were training for a job that they hope to never have to do.
But it is a job someone still has. About 150 active missile sites remain in North Dakota.
Now, I thought it was interesting that they actually had the key in the ignition, so to speak, ready to go. So how quick were they? How quick could they launch a nuclear missile back then?
Well, they could do it very quickly, but it has to be an order from the president. Now, it's a little bit of a misnomer because those keys are actually not necessarily in the ignition. What would happen is these missileers had codes and separate access to separate parts of a lockbox that's also in the facility. There really is a rigorous security fail-safe in place to prevent any one person from being able to launch one of those nuclear missiles. But, you know, there was a time when there was always this active state of readiness that you could get called to pull that key out of its lockbox at any time.
So how much room is down there? How much square footage? Is it a living area? I guess the military would be down in there for long periods of time.
You know, they would work 24-hour shifts down there, maybe even a little bit longer. It's interesting. It's the size of perhaps a large apartment or a small house. One side of this structure is where the generator or the diesel engines or the things that power the place are located. That's on one side. And on the other side is this small launch control facility. when they were actually there in the Cold War. You're behind very thick steel blast doors, very thick concrete, and it's all really buffered in the event that should there have been a nuclear war, this facility would have been protected against the fallout or the impact of a nuclear missile.
Now, North Dakota has a whole lot of missile silos there. I guess you mentioned something 150 or so, something like that now. So what's so special about North Dakota that they wanted to use so much of that space for nuclear missile sites?
Well, North Dakota is home to 2 Air Force bases, one of them being Minot, the other Grand Forks. And during the height of the Cold War, both of these facilities were in charge of the nuclear missiles that were spread out throughout North Dakota. I think at the height of the Cold War, there were something like 1,100 nuclear missiles spread out in North Dakota alone. Wow. And talking to the Secretary of State of North Dakota, Alvin Yeager, he said the running joke in North Dakota during that time was that North Dakota was the 3rd largest nuclear power in the world because they had so many nuclear missiles stationed across the state. So I think right now there are about 450 intercontinental ballistic missiles that are spread out across the United States. Right. However, applying treaty obligations, the United States is now going to reduce that number by 50, and that is the lowest number since the height of the Cold War.
Well, what do people think about their nuclear home, if you will, in North Dakota? They have so many of them there. They've obviously been living with them for so long, but what do people say about that?
They don't say anything. As a matter of fact, they just don't think about it. People in North Dakota have lived next to these missiles for decades. It's just a part of life. And in many cases, it's an unknown part of life. And they move on as if there's nothing there or it's just not a concern to them.
And that was VOA's Kane Faraba with another look at the story we first brought you back in August.
All right, let's take another break now. On the other side, we'll go back in history again, but this time to the American Civil War. You're watching On Assignment. The early 1860s were a defining time in U.S. history when the North fought the South in the American Civil War. The conflict nearly tore this young nation in half, with many notorious battles at places such as Bull Run in Virginia and the Pennsylvania town of Gettysburg.
On the streets of Gettysburg, people come together every year to reenact one of the war's most significant battles. Now the story of these reenactments, narrated by Joy Wagner.
To the naked eye, the view of this little Pennsylvania town looks like a flashback to the past. The only difference is, these soldiers and officers of the Union and Confederate armies are not on a battlefield, but peacefully discussing the military campaign of 1863 that took place over a 3-day period here 150 years ago. The people who do this call it living history. They come together every year to recreate and commemorate the Battle of Gettysburg. Each reenactor has a role. Here we meet the famous Confederate General Robert E. Lee, and over here, the heroes of the Battle of Gettysburg, the regimental and battalion commanders, and the ordinary soldiers from both the Union and Confederate armies. And of course, President Abraham Lincoln is center stage.
That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Many participants in this reenactment say the Battle of Gettysburg, one of the bloodiest battles of the war, decided the future of the United States and preserved the country as the Founding Fathers had designed it, united and strong.
The Eagle flag has a banner in the eagle's beak, and it's in Latin, and it says E pluribus unum, which means Latin for out of many one, and that's what we are. We're a lot of people from different countries in one nation.
For many Americans, historical reconstructions like these are not just a hobby, but also an opportunity to pay tribute to their ancestors and to remember the heroes who fought to create present-day America. And here in a small town, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, the descendants of those who made history on both sides are marching down the main street in one united column. This is Joy Wagner for Anush Avetsyan and Sergei Moskalev. VOA News, Washington.
Now, staying on the subject of history, really ancient history, 66 million years ago, the last dinosaurs roamed what is now the American West.
The demise of the dinosaurs from an asteroid impact is pieced back together from the fossils they left behind in an exhibit at the Smithsonian's Natural History Museum in Washington. VOA's Roseanne Skirbel went to check it out.
Here's what 7-year-old Ella Smith thinks of dinosaurs.
They're very old and cool and very big.
Ella and her mother, Paige, have wandered into a recreation of the world just before an asteroid struck the planet, destroying the dinosaurs and practically everything else. What unfolds is a preview of the new National Fossil Hall coming in 2019, says Cara Blond, exhibitions director at the museum.
We use a couple of our major specimens to kind of as the anchors for the story, and we deconstruct the world that they lived in by looking at the mechanics of how they lived, how they ate, who they lived with, what plants they fed on.
These dinosaurs lived in what is now the arid American West. But back then it was a pretty tropical place with a seaway running through it. The deltas extending from that seaway turned out to be a perfect place to die and, over time, to fossilize. This explains why the area is so fossil-rich. The uncovered remains document the birds, small mammals, and reptiles that survived after the dinosaurs died off, says exhibit curator Kay Berensmeyer.
Turtles survived. There are many aquatic ones. If they were hiding out in the water, they had more of a chance to do that, to get through. And earthworms, we actually have burrows from earthworms that are just an inch or two above the impact layer.
The striations on a rock in the exhibit show when the asteroid hit, triggering a mass extinction. Museum fossil hunters continue to send back what they dig up in the field. Some make it to the fossil lab, where volunteer Bill King sorts ancient crocodile bones.
It's like crime scene investigators, only there wasn't any crime. It's just nature and millions of years ago. And we get to do it all, hands-on, at no charge.
The flowering of the planet after the dinosaurs shows that the Earth is resilient and can regenerate over time. Berensmeyer hopes visitors of all ages take away a deeper understanding that dinosaurs were once part of an ecosystem they depended on, just like us. Roseanne Skirbel, VOA News, Washington.
Our thanks, as always, to Roseanne Skirbel and all of the reporters who contributed to this, our very first show of 2015. We are just about out of time ourselves, but we want to remind everyone to check out On Assignment on our website, voanews.com, not to mention YouTube and Facebook.
Thank you so much for watching, everyone. A Happy New Year, and we'll catch you next week.